The cornerstone of the United Nations was laid on the ashes of the victims of the Holocaust. The UN's charter proclaimed the organization would be dedicated to fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of the human person, and the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small. Its flagship, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, begins by acknowledging the debt, whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. These are grand principles, and the loftiness of the vision makes the betrayal of the promises all the more deep. For the centerpiece of today's United Nations human rights system is the inequality of the Jewish people and the constant attack on the legitimacy of their self-determination realized in the State of Israel. Judaism and the indelible scars of intolerance have inclined the Jewish people to care not only for their own welfare, but also for that of others facing hardship and persecution. Human rights are their cri de coeur. It is not surprising, therefore, that the project of the United Nations was a source of inspiration to a generation of Jews and has commanded allegiance from Jewish leaders active across the human rights movement. I am therefore profoundly regretful to be forced to conclude that the UN human rights system has been irrevocably hijacked, corrupted, and lost to those who stand the most to gain from its demise. The death throes have been evident for some time, but in many ways, events only this past Friday plumbed new depths of depravity. The General Assembly Committee of the Whole, charged with humanitarian affairs whose decisions are rubber-stamped by the Assembly plenary, declared that Israel will be the only UN member state subject to a permanent agenda item of the Human Rights Council. All other 191 UN members may or may not one day be considered under the general heading of human rights situations that require the Council's attention. The vote of 168 for and 7 against was met with a round of applause, though the decision tears apart the very fabric of an international order woven with the fibers of equal rights. This is the reformed UN. The Council is the replacement for the discredited Human Rights Commission, the fiction of a cure lying just beyond the horizon of UN reform is no longer available. This is the real UN. Less than 50% of members are fully democratic. There are 192 members of the United Nations General Assembly. 117 belong to the so-called non-aligned movement, NAM, and the largest single voting bloc in the NAM is made up of the 56 members of the Organization of the Islamic Conference, or the OIC. Similarly, there are 47 members of the Human Rights Council. A majority, or 26, belong to the African and Asian regional groups, and the Organization of the Islamic Conference holds a majority in both these regional groups, giving them the balance of power. The fact is that outcomes at the United Nations, pre- or post-reform, are primarily driven by states who do not share universal values or protect human rights and freedoms at home, and use Israel as a convenient diversionary tactic, caught up in the crosshairs, as it has been for a very long time. Double standards, discrimination, and demonization are the UN norm in the name of human rights. Here's the rap sheet. It's incontrovertible. The lead UN human rights body for 6 decades was the Human Rights Commission. For its last 40 years, until it was abolished in 2006, it adopted resolutions critical of specific states. 1/3 of them were directed at Israel alone. Not one ever targeted such abysmal human rights records such as those of Syria, Saudi Arabia, China, or Zimbabwe. The Human Rights Council has more than doubled that ignominious record. Today, 70% of all country-specific resolutions and decisions have been directed at Israel alone. The only UN Human Rights Committee without a generic theme such as civil and political rights or children's rights or freedom from torture, is the UN Special Committee to investigate Israeli practices affecting the human rights of the Palestinian people and other Arabs of the occupied territories. It has been in operation for 39 years. The only division of the UN Secretariat devoted to the claims and one-sided narrative of a single people is a division for Palestinian rights. This has been true since 1977. The only people with its own refugee agency designed to perpetuate refugee status from generation to generation are Palestinians. All other refugees fall within the jurisdiction of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, whose job is to end refugee status, not to prolong it. The only human rights investigator with a mandate that prejudges any investigation and permits reporting only about one side of the conflict is assigned to Israel. I'm reading his mandate: to investigate Israel's violations of the principles and basis of international law. It began in 1993. The only UN country-specific human rights investigator to have his mandate extended ad infinitum by the Human Rights Council is the one on Israel. All other country-specific human rights investigators are slowly but inexorably being eliminated. European diplomats, in fact, openly predict that within a year, all UN special investigators dedicated to uncovering and reporting on human rights violations in specific states will be abolished by the Council. All, that is, except for Israel. The only UN member state not permitted to participate fully in any of the UN's 5 regional groups is Israel. These groups negotiate resolutions, dole out UN jobs, and share information and strategic thinking. But Israeli representatives are therefore left standing in the halls of the Human Rights Council, while the anti-Israel resolutions and all the other issues are negotiated behind closed doors. The Human Rights Council to date has had 6 sessions, and apparently no time to adopt any resolution concerning such issues as women's rights, or freedom of expression, or freedom of torture, or the scourge of terrorism. But it has managed to hold 3 special sessions on Israel alone. These UN activities, translated into 6 languages, spawning hundreds of related events worldwide, are now webcast around the globe, and they have one striking consequence. The country subject to the most human rights criticism across the UN system every year is Israel. In 2006, Israel was criticized more than twice as many times as Sudan, though the Sudanese government is responsible for the murder of hundreds of thousands, the creation of millions of refugees, and ongoing genocide. The quantity of the venom which the UN spews on Israel is sadly matched by the virulence of the UN poison itself. The UN human rights investigator on Israel is emblematic of the shocking corrosion of the fundamental building blocks of the human rights system. From his human rights pulpit, John Dugard serves as a terrorist spokesperson. In his most recent written and oral report delivered to the General Assembly only a few weeks ago, he likened Israel to Nazis and the patrons of apartheid South Africa, while objecting to the presence of Jews on Arab territory, or in, as he likes to call it, Judaization. He neglects to mention that Arab citizens of Israel, 1/5 of the population, enjoy more democratic rights and freedoms in Israel than in any of Israel's Arab neighbors, or that Arab states were effectively rendered Judenrein after the creation of Israel. Instead, according to Dugard, and I'm quoting him, terrorism is a relative concept, and Palestinians who deliberately target and murder Israeli civilians and who claim to be resisting occupation are the equivalent of French resistance fighters in the Second World War. Also indicative of a human rights system corrupted beyond recognition was the racist anti-racism conference sponsored by the UN in Durban, South Africa in 2001 and scheduled to be repeated in 2009. At Durban, UN-accredited NGOs called for the reinstitution of the Zionism is Racism resolution, while UN member states decided Israel was the only state guilty of racism. The organizing committee for 2009's Durban II include Iran, a state sponsor of terrorism and advocate of genocide. Committee members have decided already to hold the first substantive preparatory session for a conference about xenophobia and related intolerance,